Hi everyone, welcome to our second and final lecture for Chapter 6, the integumentary system. We're going to be looking today at the physiology of the skin and its associated appendages. We're actually going to skip over nails and hair, so you do not need to know anything about those for any exam that we will be taking. You can skip over that as far as studying it. I will not be covering that, and you are not responsible for knowing it. What we're going to be looking at today will be things like skin color, disorders of the skin, glands of the skin, and that's what we're going to expect you to know for exams. So let's begin with our not really attendance questions. What are the layers of the epidermis from most superficial to most deep? And what sort of feedback loop is body temperature homeostasis? Go ahead and try to answer these. And hopefully you've paused the video and answered those, so let's see what the correct answers are. Layers of the epidermis from most superficial to most deep. So superficial, that's going to be the outermost layer. And deep is going to be the innermost layer. So starting from the outside, we have the stratum corneum. Then, depending on where we're looking, maybe there's the stratum lucidum, maybe there's not. We're going to skip over the stratum lucidum, so you don't have to know that one here. Stratum granulosum is next. Stratum spinosum. And then the stratum basale. So, remember, come get some bacon. Corneum, granulosum, spinosum, and basale. What sort of feedback loop is body temperature homeostasis? Body temperature homeostasis, like most of the feedback loops in the body, is a negative feedback loop. The response is opposite from the stimulus. When you get too hot, your body temperature goes up. You sweat and that cools you down, so your body temperature drops. Or we also saw that when your body temperature is down, you start to shiver and that heats you up, so your body temperature rises. So in both of those cases, the response is in the opposite direction from the stimulus. Well, previously we learned about the layers of the skin. We learned about the cell types that we find in the skin. And now today in this lecture, we're going to be kind of applying some of that information. And we're going to start with looking at skin color. Where does it come from? What is its purpose? What contributes to it? And by far, the biggest contributing factor is something called melanin. Melanin is a pigment, it's a protein made by melanocytes, which we learned about last time. And melanin is actually the only agent that contributes to skin color that is made in the skin. Everything else that contributes to skin color comes from somewhere else. Now, an interesting thing about melanin is regardless of your race, regardless of your skin color, the relative number of melanocytes is the same. There is no difference in race when we look at melanocytes. And what we see here in this picture, on the left, very, very pale skin. And as we progress to the right, we're getting a little darker, a little darker, a little darker. On the right, we have very dark skin. Now, even though we would call these different races, there is no difference as far as skin structure. The relative number of melanocytes is the same. So what is it that makes these different skin colors? Well, different types of melanin is one thing. There's something called eumelanin, which is kind of a brown or black color. And there's something called pheomelanin, which is more of a reddish yellow color. But in addition to that, and really more importantly, is the rate of melanin production. Over here on the right, where we have the darker skin tones, these people have melanocytes that are making melanin much faster than these people over here on the left with the lighter skin tones. But the relative number of melanocytes is the same. So how does melanin work? Well, melanin is made by the melanocytes. It is a protein, it's a pigment, and as it's making this melanin, it builds up inside the melanocytes. And the melanocytes are branching structures. They have extensions that kind of reach out in between the keratinocytes. And when they make this melanin, pieces of those melanocytes actually breaks off. Let's go back and look at our picture from before. Here we have a melanocyte, this kind of dark starfish looking guy down here. And we can see he's got these processes reaching out between the keratinocytes. And as he makes melanin, that melanin builds up inside, and pieces of this melanocyte actually break off. And there's pieces of melanin inside those fragments. We call those fragments with the melanin fragments in them, we call those melanosomes. So melanosomes are fragments of a melanocyte, and that melanocyte fragment contains fragments of melanin. So really what we have are pieces of melanin floating around between those keratinocytes. And those keratinocytes then will phagocytize those melanosomes. And when the keratinocytes phagocytize the melanosomes, then pieces of melanin are now inside the keratinocytes. And interestingly, those pieces of melanin are moved around inside the keratinocyte so that they are near the nucleus, but on the same side of the nucleus as the sun. So imagine, let me see if I can draw that on here. If this is a keratinocyte and the sun is shining down from this direction, the nucleus is here of the keratinocyte, well, we start to have those fragments of melanin in between the nucleus and the incoming sun, where the ultraviolet radiation is. We are protecting the DNA that's inside. Now, once we've got that melanin inside, we're protecting that DNA quite a bit, because melanin actually blocks ultraviolet radiation. Ultraviolet B radiation specifically, because ultraviolet B radiation is what causes damage. So, we will come back to that in just a moment when we start looking at tanning. First, let's talk about what are freckles. So, obviously, we don't have complete, even skin color. When we look, we can see up here in this picture, here are some darker spots on this person. Here's a dark spot there. We can even see some dark spots here. Now, and dark spots here. So, the melanin isn't always completely evenly distributed. Well, freckles are just localized concentration of melanin. Freckles are spots where the melanin is being produced locally at a much higher rate than across the majority of the skin. And it's not because that area needs more ultraviolet radiation blockage. It's actually the result of a mishap early on. So what happened early on, and you don't need to know this, but what happened early on was a melanocyte had some sort of error when it was developing, and it just naturally started making melanin at a faster rate. So, what about tanning? Well, like we just said, melanin production is really tied in to ultraviolet B radiation. Ultraviolet B radiation is what is being blocked by melanin. So why is that important? Well, ultraviolet B radiation actually causes DNA damage. And specifically, it causes something called thymine dimers. Now, I'm going to draw out what a thymine dimer is just so I can talk about it. You are not responsible for knowing what I'm about to draw. Let's look at a segment of DNA. So here's my DNA, and in this part that we're looking at, let's just draw in some nucleotides. There's my A, C, T, T, A, G. And if I know that side, think back to chapters 2 and 4. If I know that side, I automatically know the other side, right? If I have an A on one side, what do I have over here? A T. If I have a C on one side, what do I have over here? A G. So hopefully you can go through and fill this out on your own. And then the two sides are joined by what? Hydrogen bonds. Well, the reason that ultraviolet radiation is a problem is because it causes something called thymine dimers. And what a thymine dimer is, if we look here, anywhere in your DNA, and this will happen regularly, you will have two thymines right after each other on the same side. So I see a thymine here, and just beneath it, I have a thymine here. When that happens, ultraviolet radiation can come in and it breaks those hydrogen bonds. And it causes a new hydrogen bond to form in between those two thymines. And that causes a kink in the DNA. It causes that portion of the DNA to not be readable. If that part of the DNA contains a gene, we won't be able to use it to make messenger RNA and eventually use it to make protein. So we've just messed up a segment of DNA with ultraviolet radiation. Now, most of the time, that's quickly repaired. We actually have some mechanisms that come in, recognize stuff like this. They break that bond. They actually cut out this portion of the DNA and then put in new thymines. And it's like nothing ever happened. Most of the time, that is successfully repaired. But sometimes it's not. And it's the sometimes not that's the problem. If that is not repaired, then when this cell divides, what's going to happen? We're going to have two brand new cells that have the same problem. And then when those cells divide, we're going to have more cells. So this kind of thing can really cause a problem. Now, this, when it happens in a keratinocyte, is going to cause the keratinocyte to release something called melanocyte stimulating hormone, or MSH. Thymine dimers, problems with the DNA resulting from ultraviolet B radiation. When it happens in a keratinocyte, the keratinocytes release melanocyte stimulating hormone. Wonder what that does? It stimulates melanocytes. MSH is the stimulus for melanin. It tells the melanocytes to make melanin. What do the melanocytes do? They start pumping out melanin. The keratinocytes grab that melanin and start shielding themselves from that ultraviolet radiation. As you're out in the sun, you're getting this damage, you start making melanin, and your skin gets darker. So let's use that to answer a thinking cap question. You see someone with a really nice tan, but what has already happened that resulted in that tan? Well, if we go back to this, what has already happened before that tan occurs? We've just damaged our DNA. The melanocytes don't start making melanin until after there has already been radiation damage to DNA. So tanning doesn't do anything for what has already happened. It's just a response to make sure more damage doesn't happen. And given enough time, given enough sun exposure, that can cause a lot of problems like skin cancer, which we'll talk about in a little while. So continuing talking about skin color, moving away from melanin now, some other things that contribute to skin color. Well, hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is what is in our red blood cells that allows our blood to carry oxygen. It's what makes your blood red. And hemoglobin contributes a pink or red color to your skin. So that kind of pinkish hue that's really prominent in people with pale skin, that's coming from hemoglobin in the blood. Well, remember, there's a lot of blood that passes through the skin. Not in the epidermis, but just beneath it, just deep to it, there's a lot of blood there. And that blood that's passing through can contribute to the skin color. Next, keratin. Keratin has kind of a yellow or up to an orange color. And keratin, when it's in our body, some of it is actually going to be converted to vitamin A. Vitamin A helps with vision. So that's why sometimes you'll hear people say carrots are good for eyesight. Well, that's because carrots have keratin. Keratin is converted to vitamin A, and vitamin A is good for eyesight. And keratin, when it's in high enough quantities, it can contribute kind of a yellow to orange color in the skin. And that's what we see over here. So this kind of yellowish or orangish color that we see, for those of you who are old enough to remember the 90s, in the 90s, there was the juicing craze. People, for whatever reason, just decided, I'm going to go out and buy a juicer and I'm going to start juicing vegetables and being healthy. Well, people that didn't really stick with it for very long, they learned real quick that juiced carrots were one of the few things that they actually enjoyed the taste of. So they started juicing lots of carrots. And if you drink a lot of carrot juice, then you're going to be getting a lot of keratin. And that keratin builds up. And something that we saw in the 90s was people running around with kind of an orange tint to them. And it was very funny. It was very noticeable. You could tell the people that were juicing because it was a craze, because a lot of times they had this orange skin. So let's talk about some skin color disorders. We see something called cyanosis, which is right here. Cyanosis is kind of a bluish tint, really evident around the lips, really evident just inside, like at the gums, but sometimes you can also see it around the eyes. And cyanosis is due to poor oxygenation and poor blood flow. So if you're not adequately supplying oxygen to your blood and you're not adequately bringing that oxygenated blood to your tissues, then you start to get kind of this bluish tint called cyanosis. There's also something called erythema. Erythema, or sometimes it's just called redness. This can be from several different things. A lot of times it can indicate something like embarrassment or anger. It can be something related to sun exposure or an allergic reaction. But it can also indicate high blood pressure. In high blood pressure, more blood is forced into your skin, and it gives it a very red, flushed appearance. The opposite of that is pallor, and pallor is what we see down here. Pallor is a very, very pale, sometimes you'll hear it called ashen color, and this can often indicate low blood pressure. Not as much blood is being pushed into your skin, so you get a very, very pale appearance. And really what you're seeing there, when the blood is not in your skin as much, the collagen starts showing through, and collagen is kind of a whitish color, so that's what we see here. Albinism. Albinism is what we see up here in the top, and albinism is a genetic disorder that comes from melanocytes that are non-functioning. They're not making melanin. And if you don't make melanin, your skin is very, very white, very, very pale. Your hair doesn't have color to it. The eyes, sometimes they're really pale blue, sometimes they're actually almost a pink color. And it's common to think, when we think of someone with albinism, we think of a Caucasian. But any race can get albinism. It's just, if you see someone of African descent with albinism, their hair is more of almost like an orangish red color, and their skin is still very, very pale white. It's not confined just to Caucasians. Next we have jaundice. Well, let's go back to albinism real quick and talk about something that can arise from that. If you don't have melanin, you're not going to be able to protect from ultraviolet B radiation. So one thing that is seen with someone with albinism is they have a very elevated risk of skin cancer because they can't block out that ultraviolet B radiation. Back to jaundice. Jaundice is what we see down here at the bottom right. Jaundice is kind of a yellow tint to your skin, kind of what we saw with the carotene just a moment ago. Really, really prominent in the whites of the eyes, inside the mouth, palms of the hands, soles of the feet, but as we can see here, I mean, it can be all over the body. And jaundice comes about typically from someone with liver damage or liver failure. And what's happening in jaundice is your red blood cells with their hemoglobin, they have a really short lifespan. We'll learn all about that in Bio 139, but they have a really short lifespan. And once they've lived their life, they're broken down, and parts of them are recycled, and parts of them are released as waste. And when they're broken down, one product is something called bilirubin. Bilirubin is taken out of the blood, mostly by the liver. A couple other things like the spleen and bone marrow can also take it out, but primarily it's the liver. And the liver takes that bilirubin, converts it into bile, and eventually it leaves the body in the feces. But when the liver isn't functioning quickly enough, when it's not functioning at its max, then it's not pulling the bilirubin out of the blood, and it starts to build up, and that's what this kind of yellowish color is. Very common in babies that are born premature, because the babies that are born premature, well, they really don't have a functioning liver yet. There's no need, because typically when the baby's inside of mom still, mom's liver is doing the job. Baby's liver doesn't need to come online until it's born. So if a baby is born premature, then its liver really might not be functioning yet. But it doesn't even have to be a premature baby. Babies in general, their liver is just coming online, so it may not be functioning up to speed just yet. What do? They put them under an ultraviolet lamp, which helps break down that bilirubin. Next, hematoma. That's just the term for a bruise. A bruise or a hematoma is what happens when you damage a blood vessel and you start to bleed, but you have not damaged the skin, so that you have not broken the skin. You're not bleeding onto the surface of your skin. You're bleeding underneath your skin. And finally, bronzing. Bronzing is sometimes it presents as tanning in places that are not exposed to the sun, so places that are always covered by clothing. Or sometimes it's almost a metallic appearance to the skin. But bronzing is typically a sign of damage to the adrenal glands of some sort, so an adrenal gland disorder. Something like certain types of Addison's disease, certain types of Cushing's disease. Now let's talk about glands that are associated with the skin. Glands that are associated with the skin, we have Apocrine glands, also called Melanin glands. These are sweat glands. They are the most numerous type of sweat glands. They're really abundant on the forehead, the palms of the hand, the soles of the feet, and most of them empty through a sweat pore. So that's what we see over here in this image. The sweat pore is just a tube that goes from the sweat gland up to the surface of the skin. Some of them may sometimes connect to a hair follicle, but most of them empty onto the surface of the skin through a sweat pore. Now, they are about 99% water, but dissolved in that water will be dermcidin that we mentioned in the previous lecture. It's antimicrobial. There will be a little bit of metabolic waste. Now, sweat is not really there to get rid of waste, but there will be some metabolic waste in the sweat. Some things like nitrogenous wastes, like either ammonia or uric acid, stuff like that. We also will see a very low pH, so pH 4 to 6, so that's acidic. That contributes to that acid mantle that we talked about before. Now let's talk about sensible versus insensible perspiration. We are always sweating. A lot of the time, really the majority of the time, that sweat is evaporating so fast. It's evaporating as soon as it's produced. So we don't even know it. That's called insensible perspiration. We don't sense it. Now, when we're sweating and we realize it, you start to get some sweat building up on your forehead or something like that. That's called sensible perspiration, or sometimes it's called diaphoresis. Sensible perspiration, or diaphoresis, is the sweat that you are very aware of. But then we also have apocrine sweat glands. Now, while the eccrine sweat glands are more numerous, they're all over the body, but especially abundant on the forehead, the palms of the hands, the soles of the feet, the apocrine sweat glands are not nearly as numerous. They are clustered together in the armpits, around the genitals. In males, they're clustered in the beard area. And they still produce sweat. But in addition to everything that we saw in the eccrine glands, we also see fatty acids, so lipids. We see proteins. And oddly enough, this sweat is odorless. There is no smell. to this sweat that we see in the armpits, around the genitals, around the beard. But most of us probably see this and we think, I guarantee this guy does not smell odorless with that much sweat coming out of his armpits. But the sweat itself is odorless. What is it that we smell when we smell somebody with some heavy-duty body funk? We're actually smelling waste from the bacteria that live in these regions and feast on those proteins and fatty acids, those lipids. In the armpits, around the genitals, there are bacteria that live there. And as we sweat from those regions through those apocrine sweat glands, the proteins and the fatty acid lipids are basically a meal for those bacteria. And as those bacteria feast on those, they're going to produce waste. And that waste is what we smell when we smell body odor. Now, these don't begin functioning until puberty. Once we hit puberty, they actually function very, very high. And if you happen to be a parent of a teenager, you know once those kick in, there can be some very interesting smells coming off of your teenagers. Then, early 20s, they kind of taper off back to a more normal level and then function until they're elderly. But while the eccrine sweat glands are there to regulate body heat, body temperature, apocrine sweat glands play practically no role in regulating body heat. They are not thermoregulatory. So what do? Well, we seem to feel like they're pheromonal. Pheromonal means they contain chemicals that convey messages, usually sexual messages, to other members of the same species. What does that mean? Well, to kind of put it bluntly, that means body odor attracts a mate. And normally we kind of think, if somebody has some body funk going on, I'm not going to find them all that attractive. And that may be true. The ones that you're being repulsed by, you're not going to find them all that attractive probably. But there have been studies done that show when someone is attracted to somebody else, it's actually oftentimes their immune systems are complementary. What does that mean? If you have a mate and you look at what are you immune to, then your mate is very likely immune to things that you are not. And you are very likely immune to things that your mate is not. That means if you have a child, then they are going to be immune to both of those things. They're going to have a much stronger immune system than either you or your mate do individually. So how do you know what it is that your mate is immune to? Through those smells produced by apocrine sweat glands. There are some substances in the sweat that comes from apocrine sweat glands that is related directly to your immune system. And that seems to be a big factor in deciding if you are attracted to someone. You can smell them. And without thinking about it, you are deciding this person has an immune system that would produce very strong offspring. And to make it even more interesting, it doesn't even have to be someone that you can produce offspring with. This also fits in homosexuals. Homosexuals are not going to mate and have offspring. But when they look at their immune systems, the immune systems are still complementary. So that further shows that pheromonal activity is a very, very strong possibility for what these apocrine sweat glands function as. Moving on, still talking about sweat glands, but we're going to start talking about very modified sweat glands. First, we're going to talk about something called ceruminous glands. Ceruminous glands are specialized sweat glands that are found only inside the ears. And instead of producing sweat, they produce something called cerumen, which we more commonly call earwax. What does earwax do? Earwax coats the inner ear so that things do not get in as easily. Something might get trapped in that wax. It prevents them from damaging the ear. It's there to protect the ear. So really what that means is don't completely clear out all of the wax that's in your ears. The cerumen will help protect it. If you clean that out, you are making it much more likely for something to kind of inhabit your ears. Another very modified sweat gland is called a mammary gland. Mammary glands are found inside the breasts. Now, mammary glands produce milk. Now, both males and females have mammary glands. It's just typically in females, they are much more developed and actively can produce milk with very little stimulus. Males still have the potential to produce milk. It just takes much more stimulation from things like prolactin to fully cause them to go online, but they are still there, even in males. Now, moving away from sweat glands, another type is called a sebaceous gland. And a sebaceous gland is just another name for an oil gland. Sebaceous glands produce something called sebum, which is just oil. And usually they empty into a hair follicle. So here's a slide of a skin section. Here we have a hair shaft, and this purple area around it is the hair follicle. And right next to it, we see this tissue right here, which is a sebaceous gland. It kind of looks like adipose tissue. It's not, but it kind of looks like adipose tissue. And we can see that it is directly connected to this hair follicle. So the sebum, the oil, is released into the hair follicle, and then from the hair follicle, it travels up onto the surface of the skin and then spills out onto the surface of the skin. So what does this sebum do? Well, one, the hair that's inside that follicle, it softens the hair. It lubricates the hair. If you've ever seen hair under a microscope, it's actually modified dead keratinocytes. It looks like scales. This sebum softens it. It lubricates it so that it can easily grow up through. As it spills out onto the surface of the skin, it waterproofs the skin, kind of similar to what we saw with the keratin before. It waterproofs the skin. It also is bactericidal. As it spreads across the skin, it kills off bacteria. It prevents new bacteria from wanting to live there. So, several times now, we have talked about stuff that is on your skin, like dermcidin, like sebum. So all of this stuff that is there to prevent things from growing on your skin. Let's get to the part of the semester where students always give me kind of a weird look when we're in class. What this all kind of points to is that we really shouldn't bathe or shower as often as we do. Once a day is more than plenty. It's really even a little bit too much. I'm not saying stop showering, but what I am saying is every time we shower, we're washing away all of this stuff that our skin produces, and we're basically inviting bacteria and fungi and all kinds of stuff to come live on our skin. The more we shower, the more we are rolling out the red carpet for all of these critters to come live on us. Our skin does a really good job at producing substances that keep that from happening. Now let's wrap up with talking about things that can go wrong with the skin. And we will start by talking about different types of skin cancer. Now, about 1 in 5 Americans at some point in their life will get some sort of skin cancer. And regardless of the type, the biggest contributing factor is ultraviolet radiation from the sun. Now, what different types of skin cancer are there? We see them over here. Up at the top, we see something called basal cell carcinoma. Basal cell carcinoma is the most common type of skin cancer. It makes up about 80% of the cases. But even though it's the most common, it is also the least deadly. About 99% of the people that get basal cell carcinoma make a full recovery without any problem. So what is basal cell carcinoma? Those stem cells in the stratum basale, even though they're constantly dividing, they're going to start dividing more, and they're going to start dividing haphazardly, and they're going to start to invade the surrounding tissues. Next, what we see here in the middle is squamous cell carcinoma. Squamous cell carcinoma is a little bit less common than basal cell carcinoma, but a little bit more of a problem. And here it's the keratinocytes in the stratum spinosum are going to start to go through mitosis. Now, every now and then, keratinocytes will go through mitosis. As a general rule, though, they're not going to go through mitosis. Remember, we have basal cells to do that. We have those stem cells in the stratum basale that are producing all of these cells. We don't need the keratinocytes to go through mitosis. In squamous cell carcinoma, they're going through mitosis and at a pretty rapid rate. So we're starting to produce too many keratinocytes. Very rapid growth and potential for metastasis. So what is metastasis? If you've ever heard that a cancer has metastasized, that means that it has broken off and started growing somewhere else in the body. We mentioned that a little bit back in tissues. Here's melanoma, and that's what we see right over here. Melanoma is the least common. Only about 2 or 3% of skin cancer cases are melanoma. But it is the most deadly type of skin cancer because it is very highly metastatic. This is a cancer of the melanocytes, and these melanocytes will very rapidly start to migrate elsewhere. So how do you know if a cancer is problematic? Well, what we see here is something demonstrating called the ABCD rule. The ABCD rule is what we have right here in the middle: asymmetry, border, color, and diameter. Asymmetry. When one half of the mole looks different than the other half of the mole. So if it's a normal mole, it should be pretty much the same throughout. But if it's some sort of skin cancer like a melanoma, one side will probably look different from the other side. If you have a mole that you're concerned about, look at the border. When the border is very smooth, probably just a normal mole. If the border is very jagged, very irregular, then that could potentially be a melanoma. Look at the color. If we look at this mole, here we can see that it's the same color regardless of where we look. In melanoma, it's much more likely that some spots will be very dark and other spots will be lighter. And finally, diameter. Look at the diameter of the mole. If it's pretty small, Could be just a mole. Now here, if it's bigger than a pencil eraser, which, can be a little bit tricky to kind of measure against, but bigger than a pencil eraser is one of the warning signs. Now, that does not mean if you have a mole that has an irregular border, you automatically have melanoma. What it means is, if you have a mole that has these traits, it's a good idea to at least ask your doctor about it. Another thing that can go wrong with the skin are burns. And we classify burns based on how much of the skin itself, how deep into the skin is affected. And we call those by their degree. So a first-degree burn, only the epidermis has been burned. This is the least problematic. Only the epidermis has been burned. And we can see some redness. Possibly it swells up a little bit. It's going to be pretty painful. But it only takes about 2 or 3 days before it's healed. If the burn goes a little bit deeper, we call it a second-degree burn. And a second-degree burn burns all the way through the epidermis and into the upper portion of the dermis. And here in a second-degree burn, it has all of the same stuff as a first-degree burn as far as the redness, the swelling, the pain. But we will also see blistering. And this takes longer to heal. This takes about 3 or 4 weeks to heal. And then over here on the right, we have a third-degree burn, also called a full-thickness burn. A full-thickness burn burns all the way through the epidermis, all the way through the dermis, and into the hypodermis. Here, we're going to start to see some weird colors. They're going to start to look kind of brown or gray. Parts of it may even be white. There will be charred areas that are black. Those are called eschars. But weirdly, a third-degree burn, the area that is actually burned, there's not going to be any pain there. We do have pain in first degree, we do have pain in second degree, but the burned area of a third-degree burn, there's no pain. There will be pain around the burned area, but the burned area itself has no pain. Why might that be? Use that as kind of a mini thinking cap question. Well, if we've burned all the way through the dermis and epidermis into the hypodermis, we've burned off those nerves. Those nerve endings are gone, and that's what senses pain. So here in this area, there is no pain because there are no nerve endings there to sense it. Now, when is a burn a critical situation? Well, when 25% or more of the body is covered by a second-degree burn. That's a critical situation. Or when 10% or more of the body is covered by a third-degree burn. That's a critical situation. Any third-degree burn on the face, the hands, or the feet is a critical situation. So when we're talking critical, what are these things that we have to take into consideration? What is the urgent consideration when something is critical? Well, first, fluid replacement. Part of the job of the skin, since it's waterproof, is to hold liquid from the body in, not just keep liquid from outside the body out. Without the skin being intact, we're going to lose a lot of liquid. We're going to dehydrate very easily. So we're constantly having to replace body fluids. Also, infection control. We've seen so many things that the skin does to prevent infections. Well, if we've damaged a significant amount of the skin, we've taken part of our defense completely offline, and it could easily become infected. So we talked about eschars, the kind of charred areas, the blackened areas. These, for about the first 24 hours, are sterile. That's because we have completely burned away everything. But after about 24 hours, infection is going to start to sit into that charred area. So now we're going to have to start doing something called debridement. And debridement is basically scraping away that burnt, charred tissue and anything like bacteria that is potentially growing there. So we've talked about 25% more, 25% or more second degree, 10% or more third degree being critical situations, but how do you know how much of the body has been burned? Well, you're going to use something called the rule of nines, and that's what we see right here. We can quickly look at the body and get a guesstimate for how much of the skin surface has been burned by looking to see where on the body the burn occurred. The skin of the neck and head is about 9% of the body's skin. The skin of the right arm is about 9% of the body's skin. The skin of the left arm is about 9% of the body's skin. The skin of the front of the torso is about 18%. So you could think of 9% chest, 9% abdomen. Same thing on the back. The upper part of the back, 9%. The lower part of the back, 9%. So 18% on the back. The front of the right leg, 9%. The back of the right leg, 9%. So a leg is 18% total. Left leg, same thing. The front, 9%. The back, 9%. So the left leg, 18%. And then 1% around the genitals and anus. So you can quickly look at someone who's been burned and based on this rule of nines, get an estimate for how much or how extensive that burn is. Okay, so when we look at the outline, disorders are self-study. Some of them are in your textbook. Some of them you may have to do a little bit of online searching. But that is the end of the integumentary system. We've got 3 lectures coming up on the skeletal system, or bones, and that will wrap up Unit 3. If you have any questions at all, let me know. I'll talk to you next time. Take care.